Hi, welcome to Intro to Soc. Today we're just going to be doing a general overview of what sociology is, how we can use it, and how it's a little bit different from some of the other fields that you might encounter. So these are going to be the first part of our learning objectives. So first, what is sociology? What do we mean when we say society? What's the difference between sociology and psychology? What is a sociological perspective? What's involved in it? Why does it matter? Who is C. Wright Mills? And what did he mean when he came up with the sociological imagination? How do we think sociologically? Or in other words, how do we use it? How do we apply it in our everyday lives? Next, what's kind of the promise of sociology? What can it do for us? Why is this course going to be important going forward? So first off, what is sociology? So really simply breaking it down, sociology is a study of people, groups, societies, social behavior, and interactions. So kind of what it sounds like. So what is a society then? Society can have a lot of different meanings, kind of depending on whatever field you're looking at. For the purposes of this class, we're going to keep it nice and simple. So society is essentially a group of people and institutions that exist in the same geographical location or territory that have kind of agreed upon certain customs, norms, and rules. So when we talk about institutions, those are going to be things like our school system, the educational system, churches, governments. So some of those kind of big overarching institutions that we're involved in. And then when we talk about things that we agreed upon, that's going to be, certain laws that we have, certain behaviors that we're okay with, behaviors that we're not okay with. So kind of following up on that. So again, what is sociology? We consider sociology to be a perspective. You've probably heard the term perspective before. In simple terms, a perspective is just a way of looking out at and understanding the world. So if you think about, you might have a perspective that's different from the person next to you, kind of the same way. So sociology is just one lens or a pair of glasses that we can kind of use to see the world and to try to understand it. One thing I really want to emphasize here is that just because we have the sociological perspective, that doesn't mean that sociology can explain everything, that it's necessarily right about everything, that it's better than any other discipline. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So before we get into this, I want you to kind of think to yourself, it's okay, there's no right or wrong answer, just think to yourself about this. How is sociology different from psychology? So just kind of pause, take a little break, think about what that means to you. So here's the difference, and there are some differences, even though they kind of sound a little bit alike, and it seems like we might use the terms a little bit interchangeably. It's easy to kind of think that they're a little bit the same thing. They're close, but they are different. So here we're looking at a Venn diagram here. So on the left side, we have psychology. Within this circle here, we see that psychology focuses on the individual and their individual mental health functioning. So that could be things like cognitive functioning. So think cognition, memory, processing. We look at emotional states, of course, things like motivation. Psychology also focuses on understanding individual behavior and group dynamics. So you do have social psychology, which is kind of where you get that overlapping that maybe you might be thinking of. But over here on the right-hand side, we've got the circle with sociology. So the way that sociology is different from psych is that it focuses more on society. So it's looking not just at the individuals, but looking at society and patterns and trends more broadly. So sociology explores social behaviors, so behaviors that happen within groups, organizations, cultures, and institutions. Sociology explores how society is shaped. So what are the things that bring us together? What are the things that help us stay together over time? Next, it also explores how society and individual interactions shape individual pathways. So when we say psychology and sociology are different, that doesn't mean that sociology doesn't care about the individual, right? It's more that sociology is focusing on how these broader things like schools, governments, the society that we live in, mass media, family, how these really broad institutions shape the way that individuals behave, how they think, how they form perceptions. So long story short, psychologists and sociologists are actually both concerned with human behavior and humans' relationships to one another in their environment. So in that way, we're the same. We're just kind of looking at things a little bit differently. So kind of going back to perception, the way I like to explain is it's like this, right? So consider that you have two aliens, right? You got two aliens. They've been tasked with exploring Earth, figuring out what's going on our planet. So Alien 1 is tasked with observing what's happening on Earth from the spaceship, right? So they're up high, they're looking down. Meanwhile, Alien 2 is going to be tasked with observing from the ground. So they are actually getting in there, looking at like what people are doing, what's actually happening on the Earth, as opposed to that Alien 1 who's just kind of looking down. So what they see is this. So from the ship, kind of looking above, Alien 1 kind of, just sees a lot of territory, not really seeing much that's individualistic. They don't really see many people. Maybe they see a car driving by. Meanwhile, Alien 2, who's kind of looking at society from the ground, is seeing people actually in a car, right? So he's actually seeing people coming through. He's seeing like their individual differences. So when they come back together, they describe to each other what they've seen, and they figure out that they're kind of describing a car, even though they viewed it from different perspectives. So Alien 2 got to see something extra, right? They get to see the individuals. So long story short, sociology is described as seeing the general from the particular, whereas psychology is looking at things very specifically. Psychology is looking at particular characteristics, traits, personality, things like that. Sociology is focusing on general patterns, trends, and commonalities. So one way I like to think of this is kind of like sociology is your view of society from a skyscraper, as opposed to kind of being on that ground level. So you're not seeing the individual faces, the emotions, individual problems. Rather, you're seeing maybe like a group of people going in generally the same direction. They look alike, right? So we're trying to figure out why that is. So the general from the particular. So overall, we call this a sociological perspective. And again, just want to reinforce, this doesn't mean that's the psychological perspective, the biological perspective, the anthropological perspective don't matter, or the sociology is necessarily better. We're just looking at things in a different way. So overall, society or sociology is just a way of seeing and understanding the world around us. It's just one way, but it's focusing on how society is involved in the growth and development of our attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and lifestyles. So from a psychological perspective, they're looking more at how people behave, how they think, how they develop, and how they might be shaped by things like brain chemistry, cognitive ability, trauma, or personality. From a sociological perspective, our attitudes, values, beliefs, and opinions and lifestyles are all shaped by our interactions with other people and institutions. Again, institutions are those big kind of overarching entities like school systems. They could be mass media, your peer group, the government, whatever educational system you are in, even down to your family. So essentially, from a sociological perspective, who you become depends on your social conditions. And this term social conditions is important. Take note of it. Social conditions is essentially the situation or circumstances you are in that are kind of influenced by your social environment. So that could be things like income or social class, as another term, educational opportunities. So did you go to a school that was really well funded? Did you go to a school that had lots of extracurricular activities? Did you go to a prestigious school that helped you get scholarships? Healthcare availability. So do you have a nice hospital that you can go to, or is it pretty understaffed, not really good? Crime levels is another thing you can consider. So we often take for granted how well we're shaped just by being in a relatively safe town, right? So you're not necessarily in Manhattan expecting to go out and be mugged or assaulted or to hear shotguns going off at all hours of the night. Some folks are. So social conditions are these circumstances under which you're living that are going to kind of shape your outcomes, your attitudes, your beliefs, and perceptions. So it's focusing again on the social environment. You'll notice here that we're not talking about things like trauma. We're not talking about personality, not talking about memory and cognition. Again, these are based in the social world as opposed to that individual. So when we talk about society, we're talking about external factors, right? Not saying that internal factors don't matter or don't have an impact. We're just focusing on something that's a little different. So I always like to bring up that going and talking about sociology, talking about the impact of external factors on the way that we live, that doesn't suggest that people don't have any control over their own lives. So when we talk about things that are external, it's easy to kind of assume that everything's kind of deterministic. So that you will necessarily end up in a bad way if you live in a crime-riddled neighborhood, if you don't have access to education that's good, or you receive really poor healthcare. those things don't help, but they're not inevitable, right? So we're not saying that you're necessarily predetermined to basically have a bad life just because you had bad social conditions. So just keep that in mind. Lastly, it doesn't suggest that people should not be held accountable for their actions, right? So again, this isn't deterministic. You should be held accountable, right? So at the end of the day, we do have free will, we do have choice. Rather, what the sociological perspective is suggesting is that, there is power in kind of being aware of environmental influence. So kind of understanding where a person's coming from might help to better explain the behaviors that maybe seem a little bit unexplainable going forward. But we can look beyond personal traits and shortcomings to kind of consider how people's environments affect their behavior and their motivations. So essentially, sociology helps to explain why we're different, but it doesn't excuse negative behavior. So think about this scenario. Let's say Johnny's dad is a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he's attending college at Columbia. Mason's also attending Columbia, but he grew up in poverty with a mother who's kind of facing some addiction troubles. Imagine how each student's social conditions, again, those things that are external to themselves, affected their college journey. So to start kind of breaking this down, what do you think are some things that matter in ensuring that you're successful in college? Think about that. What are some things that matter? Next, why is the journey to college easier for some than others? And again, we're trying to think outside of, personal traits, characteristics, and shortcomings. So before we move on from this slide, I just want you to think about that situation. Think about how maybe Mason's path to college was paved a little bit differently than Johnny's. Maybe Mason struggled a little bit, kind of given the social conditions that he grew up in. Now, at the end of the day, we want to assume that Mason and Johnny both leave Columbia with a degree, right? So just because Mason grew up with some difficult social circumstances doesn't mean that he doesn't have the abilities to succeed. It just maybe means he had a couple stumbling blocks that maybe Johnny didn't. So next, we're going to talk about the sociological imagination. This is going to be a really important part of this class generally, so please kind of keep this in mind. The sociological imagination is a term that was coined by a guy named C. Wright Mills, so keep him in mind as well. And according to Mills, he argued that, when we look at society, we kind of are stuck in our own little world sometimes. Our worldview is actually kind of small, and it kind of limits what we can learn about ourselves and our capacity to exert agency, or the ability to influence change. So a key term that I want you to remember here is the term milieu. A milieu is a person's immediate social environment, experiences, and worldview. It's basically their set of social conditions. So according to Mills, people often feel trapped and not in control of their lives and the events that are happening around them because we're so stuck in our own little worlds, right? So when we say, I just don't understand why that person's doing this, that's kind of the end of it, right? So we don't really try to think about, maybe they grew up differently than me, or maybe maybe their parents had different values and attitudes than mine did, and maybe this helps to explain their behavior. Because when we get so stuck in our own milieus or our own immediate social environment, we can only kind of know what we know, right? So sociology and the sociological imagination is ideally something that's going to help us try to overcome this. So next, think about this. So can you think of any movie or TV characters who you think maybe kind of have a little bit of a limited worldview and have a really hard time considering anybody outside of themselves? So I've got a couple that I came up with. So one, you got Michael Scott from The Office, right? So there's a lot of faux pas, a lot of blundering, has kind of a hard time thinking of anybody outside of himself. You also have Eric Cartman from South Park. That's kind of an obvious one. If you watch Parks and Rec, you also have Jeremy Jam, right? The council person who he's just kind of narrow-minded, doesn't really consider how the way that he rules on things is going to affect anybody else but himself. So here we've got a picture of Michael Scott, and he says, "I'm dead inside." And I'm wondering, do you ever feel this way? So what are some ways that Michael's ego and limited worldview affect his relationships with others? How could he maybe change to be a better boss and a better friend? So whichever character you came up with in your mind, kind of think about that. Like, how does their basically selfishness, right? Their inability to see what other people need, their inability to understand where other people are coming from. How does that affect the relationship with other people? What are some things that they could do to maybe be a little bit better? So in essence, the sociological imagination is a vivid awareness of the relationship between our experiences and wider society. So instead of just thinking of ourselves as an island, we think of ourselves as a connected part of society. So where do we fit? Essentially, it's a journey from us. So we're thinking about our own personal issues, our own problems, our own experiences. So us as individuals to we as being a part of the whole of society. So where do we fit in? So by using the sociological imagination, we can kind of begin to understand our personal problems as a sign of larger social issues, right? So when it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of, you know, I'm really struggling financially and it feels kind of like a woe is me, right? We tend to get stuck on our own problems. But when we start to think about broader society, we start to, especially if you watch TikToks, right? Once you start getting an algorithm going, you start to see very quickly you're not the only person experiencing a lot of these things. So we start to see our personal problems as a sign of larger social issues, not just a problem for ourselves. So how can we use the sociological imagination? So first we consider ourselves, right? So that's thinking about our own selves and our own milieu, our own experiences, our own perceptions, our own worldview. Next, we try to consider other people. So, right, we start to take a little step outside of ourselves. You know, that person next to me in class, gee, like maybe they came from harder circumstances than I did. Maybe they didn't have as many extracurriculars as me, so they're kind of really scrambling to get scholarships here. So we consider ourselves, we consider the other people around us, then we start to consider ourselves as a group. So not just us versus them, not just us on an island, but us as a total group. And once we're able to do that, we kind of start to be able to consider ourselves as a society. So I want you to think about this. This is an exercise in using the sociological imagination. What do you think? What are some reasons why you think a person might become homeless? And when you do this, I want you to, again, kind of resist that urge to think of the individual, to think about it on a psychological scale, but think on a sociological scale. So remember, we're thinking outside of ourselves, outside of our experiences, and consider other people's social conditions that might have led them to homelessness. So take a couple minutes and think about that to yourself. So once you've done that, let's imagine homelessness. Let's imagine it from the sociological perspective. So again, we're going to go through the whole process, right? So we're thinking first in my world. So as an individual, kind of based on my own experiences, my own attitudes, my own values, I might say, you know, a homeless people, they're just there because they're lazy. Maybe they have a lack of values. Maybe they don't have a good work ethic. Maybe they got addicted. So that's just kind of my perception. But let's step outside of ourselves and imagine that other people live differently. So in their world, maybe their family couldn't afford college for them. Maybe they didn't have opportunities to get scholarships to kind of advance in society through education. Maybe they can't afford insurance and their health is collapsing. Maybe they can't afford a phone or a car. So I want you to think about applying for jobs today, right? If you haven't started doing it, you're going to do it here in the next few years. How easy do you think it would be to get a job in today's society if you don't have a phone or a reliable mode of transportation? It's going to be really, really difficult. So perhaps even though you have a car, even though you have a phone, other people don't. So it may not just be laziness or lack of values. So we've thought about ourselves, our own perceptions, we've thought about other people. Now let's think about some broader social problems, right? So you could start looking at things like, well, you know, our society, we don't have really a lot of housing options, and the housing options that we do have are really expensive. Maybe our society doesn't provide enough aid for veterans who might be coming back and are having a really hard time adjusting. Maybe they can't find a job, maybe they can't find mental health care. Similar, like little access to mental health care services. So if a person can't afford a therapist, they try to go to Pawnee Health Center here, and guess what? They're totally booked for the next 2 months. So what are they going to do? So the point of this exercise is just kind of get out of our own selves, get out of our own attitudes and perceptions of what we think the problem is and the explanations for the problem. And to start thinking about other people and how maybe people with different social conditions from us might have a little bit of a harder time. So why does sociology matter? Essentially, what is the promise of sociology? What does it give us back? So one, the sociological perspective gives us perspective on the lives and experiences of other people. Essentially, a lot of sociology is an exercise in empathy, just kind of stepping out of ourselves and our own understandings of problems to think about how other people might experience the world a little differently. Next, it helps us to identify shared problems and to seek solutions, right? So if all of us in society just kind of sat on our island and stood around and moped in our own individual problems, how would we ever solve anything? Right. So being able to recognize, oh, like this isn't just a problem that's affecting me. Take student loan debt, right? So sure, that's an individual problem, of course, but it's not just you, right? It's thousands of other people who are experiencing the same thing. So once we're kind of able to come together and recognize, hey, I have that problem too. Like this is much bigger than just me as an individual. We're kind of able to identify a problem and start seeking some solutions. Next, sociology empowers us by helping us to understand how we became who we are. So when we start thinking about, I have these attitudes, I have these values, and I have these beliefs, but where do they come from? So we start thinking about, how was I influenced by my family? How am I influenced by the mass media? How was I influenced by the school that I went to, by the job that I have? So those are the promises of sociology, right? So it helps us to step outside of our own individual experiences, to start thinking about other people, to start seeing our individual problems as being linked to some broader ones, and then helps us to understand who we are and why we became the way we are. So essentially, we can start to see the general in the particular and see what we kind of take for granted. We begin to see and explain differences and nuances in our experiences and those of others. So next question I want you to think about on your own. What can using your sociological imagination do to help you relate to others in your own field? And there's going to be lots of different ones, right? We've got folks here who are going into education, who are going to become teachers. We have folks going into wildlife and forestry. Some people are going to go into medicine. Some people are going to law enforcement. But how can using your sociological imagination, or essentially using empathy, thinking about outside of yourselves, thinking about the experiences and conditions of other people, help you to relate to others? Okay, so moving on, this is going to be our next set of learning objectives. We're switching gears just a little bit here. So first, we're going to talk about the social construction of reality. So how do things become real? How do we decide what's important? What is social structure and why does it matter? We're going to talk about the things we take for granted. So those things that just seem kind of common sense. Where did they come from? Going to talk about social knowledge. How does it change? How is it transferred? And how do we learn social knowledge and pass it on? So the social construction of reality is essentially saying that society is a human product. So society didn't just come from nothing. It didn't just come from a great bang, right? So man is essentially a product of society. So we decide what's true. We decide what's real. We decide what's important, what's significant. So kind of the first guys to really look at this are Berger and Luckman. So they asked some questions about society. So why do we do what we do? How do we know what we know? How do we decide what's right or what's wrong? How did common sense become common, essentially? So some of these questions seem kind of like, no duh, why would we even think about that? But they wanted to, right? So we can't just assume that one day we decided that green means go and red means stop. That had to have come from somewhere. So essentially what social construction is that people in a society come to an agreement through their interactions with one another that certain practices and ideas exist. And once these are accepted as truth, society is kind of less prone to disruption and chaos. So you can imagine how chaotic of a world it would be if, not everybody agreed that the green signals go and red means stop. We'd be crashing into each other all the time, right? At some point, we agreed that credit cards and debit cards are basically the same as cash. If not everybody agreed on that, we would have a lot of arguments, right? Or that it's important to go outside and wear clothes. That's not common in every society. Some societies don't do that. But here we've decided that it is important. So if we didn't all agree on those things at some point, things could have gotten a little complicated. So what is social structure? I want you to remember this term as well. So social structure is essentially the patterned relationships between people that help us kind of make sense of our position in society. They help us to organize, guide, and sometimes limit our behavior. So for example, our social structure helps you recognize who's in charge of you, recognizing authority. So that could be your parents, that could be your teachers, the police, or your boss. So social structure just kind of tells us where we fall in line with everybody else. So that means people who are in charge of us, the people that we're in charge of. So just kind of keep that in mind. We'll talk more about this all throughout the semester and why it really matters. So not everybody is going to recognize authority the same way. So conflict is going to happen in a society no matter what. So perhaps you know some classmates who kind of seem to get away with things because their parents were donors. Perhaps their wealth positions them differently within the social structure than those who are less wealthy. So social structure does matter. For some people, if you're high on the social structure, everything's great, everything's gravy. If you are low on the social structure, it's gonna maybe be a little harder for you. People aren't gonna be as willing to listen to you. People are gonna feel like they have more right to boss you around than maybe some of those other people that are higher up. So there are some things that we take for granted. So Berger and Luckman argue that there are things in society that we all accept as true if we are to maintain order in society. So again, we talked about some of these. So we know in our society that red means stop and green means go. We agree in society that money has value. It's not just like a piece of paper, like you can exchange it for something. We agree in society that words exist. Essentially, all words are just scribbles until we decided that they mean something. We also agree that countries exist. There's, like, when you think about it, there's essentially no such thing as the United States. There's no such thing as France. There's no such thing as England. We at some point had to decide, you know what, we are drawing these lines and they mean something. These have become individual countries. So we didn't just make these rules up on our own. So where did they come from? So like C. Wright Mills, Berger and Luckman argued that people should not just accept that things are natural, inevitable, or unchangeable. Everything comes from something, and there is potential for change in most things. Society cannot arise from nothing. We're essentially glued together, stuck together by shared assumptions like common sense, like the things we just talked about truths that we can kind of create through our interactions with each other. So social knowledge is knowledge about what's valuable, what's true, what's moral, and social knowledge is constructed through social interactions that individuals are taught to believe and accept as new members of society. So eventually we all learn that stuff, right? That money matters, that it means something, that it can be exchanged for other goods and services, that red means stop and green means go, that there's such a thing as countries, that names mean something, that we have different subjects that we learn. So at some point in time, we had to have decided that these things are important, these things are true, and then we start to pass those on down the line. So there are 3 stages of social construction. I'm not super concerned with you knowing this specifically. It's just kind of interesting, right? So first you have externalization. So a group of people, for example, decide that a credit card is as valuable as cash. At some point in time, there was no such thing as a credit card, right? Somebody had to hand a cashier a credit card first and say, you know, this is as good as cash. It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Next, there's objectification, which happens when others start essentially using credit cards and no longer remember the names of the creators. So it's not like, I don't think any of us could ever name the creator of the credit card or the first person to ever use it. It's just kind of become embedded in our society. We're used to it. So that leads to the final stage, was this internalization. So nobody even questions the value of credit cards anymore. We just accept them and we accept that they're as valuable as cash. But that had to have started somewhere. Essentially, we're master builders, right? So things are just things with no meaning until we decide that they have meaning and value. So without our mutual agreement about it, a dollar bill's just a little bit of paper and a little bit of metal. But eventually we decided that the dollar bill has monetary value, right? We can exchange it, it has exchange value. So we are bound together by our agreement that certain things are true, valuable, and moral. And this is social knowledge. So how do we learn social knowledge? Where does it come from for us individually? So the sociological term for common sense, or the things we just know to be true, are called norms, right? So for example, in our society, we don't eat spaghetti with our hands, right? So that's kind of common sense. Or, you know, if you go to the bathroom in a public place, you close the door or close the stall if you're, you know, going number 2. I don't know. We construct norms so that we reach an agreement on what behavior is normal and acceptable. And the way that we do this is a process that we call socialization. And eventually later on, we're going to have a whole chapter going over socialization. But essentially, socialization is a process by which we learn what's considered normal and acceptable behavior within our group, organization, or culture. And this helps us make sure, that we fit in, that we're going to be okay in our society. So where do we learn this? We've already kind of talked about what an institution is, and that's primarily where it comes from. So we have places like family, school, religion, the law, the government. So these are some places where we learn social knowledge. So if we figure out pretty quick, if you murder somebody, that's against the law and you're going to get arrested, right? So if you figure out how to eat when you start coming up with your family, you figure out how to obey authority when you start getting to school. If you are a religious person, you learn about what's normal in terms of religious practice from your church. So that's not just how it is, right? So one of the main things about social knowledge is that it's not eternal or unchangeable. We should look to social knowledge and our understandings of common sense as a way to see what our society values as truthful and valuable at the moment. That doesn't mean that it's always going to stay that way. Now, some things are going to have more longevity than others, right? So you might have, for example, it's likely, I don't foresee any time in the future that stoplights are going to go away, right? I think that those are going to last a long time. They may change, you never know. But, back in our parents' generation, it was not acceptable to smoke weed, and now it's starting to become normalized. It's become decriminalized. So things can change, even though it seems at the time like they're eternal. So what do you think here? So what are some things that you do or that we do as a society that have been instilled in you as common sense? So what are some things that we just know to be true? Next, can you think of things that your parents' generation thought was common sense or normal that's just no longer considered such, right? So we kind of talked about the legalization of some drugs, for example. The desire to get married has changed, right? So there's a lot of people who no longer want to be married. They no longer see their life with children, when that used to be the obvious answer, 50 years ago. So what are some things like that? So essentially, where does common sense come from? It comes from us. That's the main takeaway that I want you to think about, right? So society doesn't just come from nothing. It has to come from somewhere. We as a collective have to decide that things have meaning, that something's just true, that something is moral and therefore should be against the law if you violate it. So it comes from somewhere. So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the semester. And I also want you to keep in mind again that just because a sociological perspective talks about external factors is not deterministic, right? So we do still have a sense of free will. Just because somebody came up with rough circumstances doesn't mean that they're not going to be successful in the future. Does it make that journey harder? Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it's kind of a end all be all. So just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the semester. And I hope that you enjoyed this first lesson, and I look forward to getting to talk to you more about sociology. Have a great day.